You're sitting in a dockside tavern in Portsmouth on a cold evening in 1758. The fire crackles, your third pint sits half empty before you, and you're laughing with friends about the day's work at the rope walk. You notice a group of rough-looking men enter, but taverns are full of rough-looking men in a port town, so you think nothing of it. You certainly don't notice the well-dressed lieutenant who slips in behind them, his Royal Navy uniform marking him as a man with the king's authority behind every word. Within moments, heavy hands clamp down on your shoulders. You try to stand, to fight, but there are too many of them. A cudgel cracks against your skull, not hard enough to knock you unconscious, but enough to daze you, to make resistance futile. You're dragged into the street as your friends scatter like pigeons. Some try to help but are beaten back. Others flee, hoping they won't be next. The last thing you see of your old life is the tavern door swinging shut and the faces of men you've known for years, pale and terrified, peering through the windows. This is how it happens. This is how thousands of men found themselves aboard His Majesty's ships during the 18th century, their freedom stripped away in an instant, their lives fundamentally altered by a system that was both legal and utterly ruthless. The press gang system. The press gang, or impressment service as it was officially known, was the Royal Navy's solution to a persistent and desperate problem. They needed far more sailors than were willing to volunteer. During the frequent wars of the 18th century, the Navy might need to crew hundreds of ships with tens of thousands of men. The pay was poor, the conditions were abysmal, the food was barely edible, and everyone knew that disease killed more sailors than enemy action ever would. Volunteers were scarce, and the Navy had quotas to fill. The legal justification for impressment rested on the principle that in times of national emergency, the Crown had the right to compel maritime workers into naval service. This wasn't quite slavery, the authorities insisted. Pressed men would be paid, albeit irregularly and poorly. They would receive the same rations as volunteers, such as they were. And technically, only experienced seamen could be impressed, men whose skills were needed and who, the reasoning went, had a patriotic duty to serve. In practice, the system was far more indiscriminate and brutal than the official guidelines suggested. Who the press gangs targeted? The press gangs roamed port cities and coastal towns, always on the hunt for able-bodied men. Their primary targets were merchant seamen, men who already possessed the skills the Navy desperately needed. If you'd spent years working on trading vessels, you knew how to handle rigging, you understood sail trim, you could work aloft in heavy weather. You were exactly what the Navy wanted, and your experience made you valuable enough to kidnap. But the gangs weren't always particular about maritime experience, especially when quotas needed filling. They took watermen who ferried passengers across rivers, fishermen who'd never ventured beyond coastal waters, even laborers from the dockyards who could barely tell a halyard from a hawser. The Navy would train them, or more accurately, would throw them into situations where they'd learn quickly or die. The press gangs operated with a particular cunning. They knew where maritime workers gathered, taverns near the docks, brothels in the sailor town districts, boarding houses where merchant crews stayed between voyages. They learned the schedules of merchant ships arriving in port, and they'd be waiting at the docks when crews came ashore with months of pay burning holes in their pockets. They'd watch for men stumbling drunk through the streets in the early morning hours, easy prey who couldn't run and couldn't fight back effectively. Timing mattered enormously. The gangs were most active when Britain was at war, and the Navy was expanding rapidly, when a pressing need for crews overrode any concerns about public relations or the niceties of the law. In peacetime, impressment might be rare or non-existent. But when war broke out with France or Spain, the press gangs descended on port towns like locusts, and no maritime worker could feel safe. Who was protected? Not everyone could be pressed, at least not legally. The system had exemptions, carved out through a combination of practical necessity, political pressure, and social class privilege. Masters and mates of merchant vessels were technically exempt, though this protection was sometimes honored more in the breach than in the observance. Ship's carpenters and other specialized craftsmen often carried protections, documents certifying their essential role in the merchant marine. These papers were supposed to shield them from impressment, but a protection was only as good as the officer's willingness to honor it, and many men found their documents dismissed as forgeries or irrelevant. Men working in certain reserved trades were also protected. Those employed in the Greenland whale fishery, for instance, were exempt because their industry was considered vital to Britain's economy. Apprentices were protected, at least until they completed their indentures. Thames watermen, the men who ferried passengers and goods around London, fought hard for and eventually won exemptions, recognizing that their livelihoods depended on not being randomly swept up by press gangs. Social class provided its own protection. Gentlemen were never pressed. Neither were men of property or established merchants. The press gang might operate with the force of law, but it was a law that understood very well whom it could and couldn't target. A well-dressed man with education evident in his speech could generally talk his way past a press gang, while a laborer in rough clothes speaking in a thick regional accent would be dragged away without ceremony. Geography offered some protection, too. Inland towns and cities were generally safe from press gangs, which focused their efforts on ports and coastal areas. If you lived 50 miles from the sea and never went near it, you'd likely never see a press gang in your life. But if you lived in Portsmouth, Plymouth, Bristol, or any of the major ports, the threat was constant and real. The moment of capture. The actual moment of being pressed was often violent and always traumatic. The press gangs operated in groups, typically led by a lieutenant or midshipman with several tough sailors and sometimes Marines to provide muscle and intimidation. They carried cudgels, and they weren't hesitant about using them. Resistance was met with immediate force. Some men were taken from their beds in boarding houses, roused from sleep by rough hands and threats. Others were grabbed on the street as they walked home from work. Many, like in our opening scenario, were taken from taverns and alehouses where they'd gathered to drink and socialize, places where the press gang could round up multiple men at once. The violence wasn't incidental to the process. It was essential to it. The press gang needed to establish immediate dominance to make resistance seem futile. They needed to move quickly before a crowd could gather, before friends and neighbors could organize a rescue attempt, before word could spread and potential targets could flee. Speed and shock were their primary weapons. If you fought back, you'd be beaten. If you ran, you'd be chased down. If you had friends who tried to intervene, they'd be beaten too, or pressed themselves. The press gang had the law on their side, and they had weapons and training. You had none of those things. Once grabbed, you'd be marched or dragged to wherever the press gang had set up its temporary headquarters, often a commandeered building near the docks, or sometimes directly to a waiting ship's boat. There you'd join other pressed men, all of you confused, angry, terrified, or drunk, or all of these things at once. Some men wept. Others raged impotently against their captors. A few tried to bargain, insisting they had protections or exemptions, pulling out papers that were usually ignored. Most just sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened to them. The first hours, those first hours after being pressed, were a blur of chaos and disorientation. You might be held in a warehouse or a ship's lower deck with dozens of other pressed men. Guards watched constantly to prevent escape attempts. There was no privacy, no comfort, often no explanation of what would happen next. Some men had been pressed while stone drunk and woke up with pounding headaches and no memory of how they'd gotten there. Others had been knocked unconscious and came to in unfamiliar surroundings, adding concussion symptoms to their confusion and fear. A few had been pressed with such efficiency that they still didn't quite believe it had happened, kept expecting someone to tell them there had been a mistake, that they'd be released and allowed to return home. Reality set in slowly or suddenly, depending on the man. You weren't going home. You weren't going to finish that job you'd started. You weren't going to see your family, not for months at minimum, possibly not for years, possibly never. Everything you'd planned, everything you'd been working toward, all of it was suddenly and violently interrupted. Your life as you'd known it was over. The press gang didn't care about your plans or your family or your obligations. The Navy needed men, and you were now one of those men. Within a day or two, you'd be transferred to a ship, where you'd begin to understand just how thoroughly your life had changed, and how much worse it was going to get. The boat ride out to the ship is your first glimpse of what's to come. You're crammed into a cutter with a dozen other pressed men, most still reeking of alcohol, some with dried blood on their faces from where they resisted. The sailors rowing the boat don't look at you. They've seen this before, countless times. You're just another batch of reluctant recruits, and they have no sympathy to spare. Then you see her. HMS Leopard, a fourth-rate ship of the line, 50 guns, riding at anchor in the harbor. She's massive, far larger than any merchant vessel you've worked on. Her sides rise like wooden cliffs from the water, pierced with gun ports that stare out like dead eyes. The masts tower impossibly high, a forest of yards and rigging that blocks out the sky. This floating wooden prison will be your home, your workplace, and quite possibly your tomb. The boatswain's pipe shrieks as you climb the side ladder, your hands clumsy on the unfamiliar rope. You stumble onto the deck, and immediately someone shoves you aside. "Move, you lubber! Stand there!" You're herded with the other pressed men to a section of the main deck, standing in a rough line while sailors go about their work around you, ignoring your presence as if you were livestock. And then he appears. Captain James Harrington walks the quarterdeck like a king surveying his domain, because that's essentially what he is. Aboard this ship, his word is absolute law. He can have you flogged until the flesh hangs in ribbons from your back. He can have you hanged from the yardarm. He can order you into situations that will certainly kill you, and you have no choice but to obey. Parliament might make laws in London. Judges might pass sentences in courtrooms. But here, on this wooden world floating in the harbour, there is only the captain. He's not a large man, Captain Harrington, but he doesn't need to be. He wears authority like his uniform, and both fit him perfectly. His face is weathered from years at sea, his eyes the cold grey of the Atlantic in winter. He doesn't look at you and the other pressed men with hatred or anger. He looks at you with something worse, complete indifference. You are tools to him, nothing more. Useful tools if you prove competent, disposable tools if you don't. The captain speaks briefly to his first lieutenant, a thin man with a permanent expression of dissatisfaction, then disappears back into his cabin. You won't see him often. The captain inhabits a different world from yours, one of private quarters and decent food, of charts and correspondence and the burden of command. You'll see the consequences of his decisions, certainly. You'll feel the effects of his moods, but the captain himself remains remote, almost mythical, a figure of absolute power who rarely descends to interact with common sailors. The first lieutenant, however, is a different matter entirely. Lieutenant Morrison steps forward, looking over the line of pressed men with the expression of someone inspecting a batch of fish at market, and finding the quality disappointing. "You men are now in His Majesty's Navy," he announces, his voice carrying the kind of educated accent that immediately marks him as your social better. "You will obey orders instantly and without question. You will learn your duties quickly. Incompetence will be punished. Disobedience will be punished severely. Desertion will be punished with death. Do you understand?" A few men mumble responses. Morrison's face darkens. "I asked if you understood. When an officer asks you a question, you answer, 'Aye, aye, sir.' Now, do you understand?" "Aye, aye, sir," you shout along with the others, the words feeling foreign in your mouth. Below the first lieutenant are the other commissioned officers, the second lieutenant, the third lieutenant, the master who handles navigation. These men live in the wardroom, a tier below the captain but far above you. They have servants, called stewards, who attend to their needs. They eat better food. They have hammocks in actual cabins rather than hooks on the crowded berth deck. They are, in the rigid hierarchy of this wooden world, gentlemen, and you are most certainly not. Then come the midshipmen, and this is where things get truly complicated and often dangerous. Midshipmen are usually boys, teenagers from respectable families learning to become naval officers. They're called young gentlemen, and they have authority over you despite often being half your age and possessing a fraction of your experience. Some midshipmen are decent enough, nervous boys trying to learn their trade and not abuse their power too obviously. Others are tyrants in miniature, drunk on their first taste of authority and eager to exercise it. You'll learn to quickly identify which is which. Midshipman Carter, 16 years old with soft hands and his father's influence behind him, delights in finding fault with sailors' work and reporting them for punishment. Midshipman Walsh, 18 and trying to prove himself, is simply incompetent, giving contradictory orders and blaming the sailors when things go wrong as a result of his confusion. But Midshipman Barnes, 20 and nearing his examination for lieutenant, is firm but fair, corrects mistakes without malice, and the sailors actually respect him. You'll learn to jump quickly when Carter or Walsh shouts, knowing that any hesitation will be interpreted as insolence and punished accordingly. The warrant officers occupy a strange middle ground in this hierarchy. The boatswain, the gunner, the carpenter, the sailmaker. These men have expertise in their trades, often earned through years of experience. They're not gentlemen and never will be, but they're essential to the ship's operation. The boatswain is particularly important to your daily life, as he's responsible for discipline among the sailors. He carries a cane made of rattan, and he's not shy about using it to encourage faster work or punish minor infractions on the spot, without bothering to report them to the officers. Boatswain Hawkins is a massive man with hands like slabs of beef and a voice that can be heard over a gale. He's been at sea for 30 years, and he knows every trick, every shortcut, every way a sailor might try to shirk his duty. He's not cruel by nature, but he's absolutely intolerant of laziness or incompetence. You'll learn to fear the sound of his cane whistling through the air, followed by the sharp crack as it connects with someone's shoulders or back. "Move yourselves, you idle dogs," is his constant refrain, punctuated by that cane. Below the warrant officers are the petty officers, the quartermaster, the boatswain's mates, the captain of the forecastle, the captain of the main top. These are experienced sailors, promoted from the ranks, men who've proven themselves competent and reliable. They supervise the actual work, translate the officer's orders into action, teach new sailors their duties. Some are patient teachers, others are harsh taskmasters who learned their trade under harsh masters and see no reason to be gentler with the next generation. And then there's you. The ordinary sailors, the able seamen, the landsmen who've never been to sea before. At the bottom of the hierarchy, subject to everyone above you, worked until exhaustion, fed barely enough to survive, punished for the smallest errors. You're not quite at the very bottom. That distinction belongs to the boys who serve as powder monkeys and officers' servants. But you're close enough. The Marines occupy their own separate hierarchy. They're soldiers, not sailors, and they regard the sailors with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. The sailors return the feeling. The Marines' primary purpose isn't to fight enemy ships. It's to keep order among the crew, to prevent mutiny, to enforce discipline with their muskets if necessary. They're quartered separately from the sailors, they eat separately, they drill separately. In battle they serve as marksmen in the fighting tops and as boarding parties, but their mere presence aboard reminds everyone that the Navy doesn't entirely trust its own sailors. Your particular mess is assigned, mess number 12 on the lower deck. You'll eat with these 7 other men, sleep near them, work alongside them. Some of them are pressed like you, others are volunteers, or at least they claim to be. It's sometimes hard to tell the difference between a volunteer and a man who saw the press gang coming and chose to join rather than be taken by force. A few are old hands, sailors who've been in the Navy for years, either because they've found no better option or because naval life is all they know anymore. One of your messmates is called Thomas, a weathered man of about 40 with tattooed forearms and a missing front tooth. He sees the confusion on your face as you try to understand where you fit in this complex hierarchy of authority and subordination. "Don't worry yourself too much," he says, not unkindly. "Just do as you're told. Keep your head down and learn quick. The captain's a hard man, but he's fair enough if you know your duty. The first lieutenant's a right bastard who'll have you flogged for looking at him sideways. The boatswain will cane you for being slow, but he won't hold a grudge. The midshipmen, well, you'll figure them out quick enough." He pauses, then adds, "And never, ever question an order. Don't explain, don't argue, don't make excuses. Just say, 'Aye,' and do it, even if you don't understand why, even if you think there's a better way. Questions get you flogged. Arguments get you clapped in irons. Just do as you're bid, and hope you survive long enough to figure out how things work. It's going to be a very long voyage." Your first day of actual work begins before dawn, though dawn and darkness mean little on the cramped berth deck where you've spent a sleepless night in a hammock, strung so close to your neighbour's that you could feel his breath on your face. The boatswain's mates come through, piping shrilly, shouting, all hands, lash up and stow!" You fumble with your hammock in the darkness, trying to figure out how to roll it properly, while more experienced sailors do it in seconds, their movements automatic from years of practice. You carry your hammock up to the deck, where it's stowed in the nettings along the sides of the ship. This serves double duty: storage during the day, and you'll learn later, additional protection against splinters and musket balls during battle. The cold morning air hits you after the fetid warmth of the berth deck, and you realize you're about to begin your education in one of the most complex working environments ever created by humans. The rigging of an 18th-century warship is a three-dimensional maze of rope, cable, and chain extending from the deck to points over 100 feet in the air. There are miles of it on this single ship, literally miles of cordage, each line with a specific name, a specific purpose, a specific way it must be handled. And you're expected to learn all of it, to know instinctively which line does what, to be able to find the correct rope in pitch darkness during a storm while the ship rolls beneath you and water crashes over the deck. Standing on deck that first morning, looking up at the overwhelming complexity of the masts and yards and the countless lines running every direction, you feel a despair so profound it's almost paralyzing. How is anyone supposed to learn this? How did the men working confidently around you ever master such complexity? The task seems impossible, and yet you have no choice but to attempt it. "You there, new man!" The boatswain's mate, a short but powerfully built man named Jenkins, grabs your arm. "You've been to sea before?" "On merchant ships, yes, but nothing like—" "Then you're not completely useless. Come with me." He drags you toward the mainmast, where a group of other new sailors are gathered, most looking as overwhelmed as you feel. "Right then, you sorry lot. I'm going to teach you the standing rigging, the running rigging, and the basics of sail handling. Pay attention, because I'm only explaining this once, and if you don't know your shrouds from your stays when the first lieutenant asks, he'll have you flogged, and I'll enjoy watching." The standing rigging, he explains, is the fixed rigging that supports the masts, the shrouds running down the sides like ladder rungs, the stays running fore and aft. These are tarred black and thick as your wrist, permanent fixtures that give the masts their strength. The running rigging is everything that moves. The halyards that raise the yards, the braces that swing them around, the sheets that control the sails, the countless other lines that allow the crew to adjust every aspect of the ship's sail plan. Jenkins points upward. See that yard up there? That's the main topsail yard. The rope running from its end down to the deck here is the main topsail brace. You pull on it to swing the yard around. This here is the main topsail halyard. That's what raises and lowers the yard. This is the main topsail sheet, controlling the bottom corner of the sail. Got it? You nod, trying to commit it to memory, but he's already moved on to the next yard, and the next, and within minutes your head is spinning with names. Foretop gallant, mizzen topmast staysail, main royal, spritsail, driver, each with its own array of associated lines. Some ropes are named for the sail they control, others for their position, others seemingly at random. A few lines have multiple names depending on which part of the ship you're working. It's a language unto itself, and you're expected to become fluent immediately. Now, Jenkins says, you're going to learn to go aloft. Your stomach drops. Going aloft means climbing the rigging, ascending to the yards where the sails are set and furled. It means working 100 feet above the deck with nothing but your grip and your balance keeping you from falling to death. You've seen sailors in the rigging from the dock, tiny figures moving with apparent ease through that aerial maze, and you'd assumed they were specialists, acrobats of some kind. Now you're realizing that every sailor is expected to do this, that it's simply part of the job. Come on then, Jenkins says, and starts climbing the shrouds on the mainmast. You follow, your hands gripping the tarred rope so tightly your knuckles go white. The shrouds form a ladder of sorts, with ratlines, the horizontal ropes connecting the shrouds, serving as rungs. It's not too bad at first. You're essentially climbing a rope ladder, something you could manage as a child. But then you reach the futtock shrouds, and everything changes. To get from the lower shrouds to the main top platform, you have to negotiate the futtock shrouds, which angle sharply outward. This means you're suddenly climbing while leaning backward, hanging over the deck far below with nothing but your grip on the ropes. Your arms burn, your hands slip on the tarred surface, and for a terrifying moment you're certain you're going to fall. But Jenkins is shouting at you to move, and somehow you scramble up and over the edge of the main top, arriving on the platform with your heart hammering and your hands shaking. Not bad for a first time, Jenkins says, though there's no warmth in the compliment. Most men piss themselves on the futtock shrouds their first go. Now look around. From the main top, the ship looks different. You can see the entire deck laid out below, sailors like insects going about their work. The harbour spreads out around you, other ships at anchor, the town beyond. The platform you're standing on is perhaps 5 feet square, with rope rigging all around, and the topmast rising above to even dizzier heights. This is where you'll be working, Jenkins explains. When the order comes to set sail or take it in, you'll come up here quick as you can, go out on that yard. He points to the main topsail yard extending horizontally from the mast, and you'll handle the sail. Let me show you. He walks out onto the yard as casually as if he were strolling down a street, not balancing on a piece of wood a few feet wide, suspended in empty air. You follow far more carefully, your arms wrapped around the yard, feet on the foot rope that dangles below the yard. The footrope sways and bounces with every movement, and the yard itself seems to shift and twist in ways that shouldn't be possible. "The sail is furled up here on top of the yard when we're not using it," Jenkins explains, patting the neatly bundled canvas. "When the order comes to loose sail, you'll untie these gaskets, these ropes holding it in place, and let the sail drop down. When we take in sail, you'll gather all that canvas back up and tie it off again." Sounds simple, doesn't it? It doesn't sound simple at all, especially when you consider doing it in a storm, in darkness, with the ship rolling and the yard bucking beneath you like a wild animal. Jenkins seems to read your thoughts and grins without humor. "You'll be doing this in all weathers," he says. "Rain, snow, gales, darkness, doesn't matter. When the order comes, up you go. I've seen men frozen to the rigging in northern waters, their fingers so cold they couldn't untie the gaskets. I've seen men washed off yards by waves that hit the rigging. I've seen men fall, usually new men who weren't careful enough or who panicked and lost their grip. The sea doesn't care about your fear, and neither does the captain. You do the job, or you die trying." Over the next several days, you begin to understand just how much there is to learn. Every sail has to be set in a specific sequence, reefed in a particular way, furled according to exact methods. The braces have to be hauled just so to get the yards at the proper angle to catch the wind. The sheets have to be tended constantly as the wind changes. It's not just about knowing the names of things. It's about understanding how every part of the rigging system works together, how pulling on one rope affects three others, how the balance of the sails determines whether the ship turns smoothly or fights the rudder. And it's not just the rigging. There's the constant maintenance that keeps a sailing ship functioning. The running rigging stretches and wears, requiring regular replacement. Chafing gear has to be added anywhere rope runs against wood to prevent it wearing through. Blocks, the pulleys that lines run through, have to be greased and inspected. The standing rigging has to be set up tight with lanyards and dead-eyes, adjusted as it stretches. On a merchant ship, you might have had time to learn these tasks gradually. Here, you're expected to master them within weeks. The worst part is working aloft in weather. Your third time going up the rigging, the ship is underway, and there's a stiff breeze blowing. The masts sway with the ship's movement, describing great arcs across the sky. The footrope under your feet swings wildly, and the wind tears at your clothes and tries to pluck you from your precarious perch. Your hands, already raw from hauling on rough rope, can barely maintain their grip on the yard. "Move faster!" the boatswain's mate shouts from below. "Get that gasket untied!" Your fingers fumble with the wet rope of the gasket, struggling to work the knot loose. The sailor next to you on the yard has already finished his and is looking at you with impatience. You finally get the knot undone, and the sail drops free, the canvas snapping and thundering in the wind with shocking violence. For a moment you're certain the force of it will knock you from the yard, but you hang on desperately, arms wrapped around the rough wood, feet scrambling for purchase on the footrope. "Get down here!" comes the shout, and you make your way back along the yard, down through the maintop, negotiating the futtock shrouds again, and finally back to the relative safety of the deck. Your legs are shaking. Your hands are bleeding from rope burns and splinters, and you feel like you might vomit from the fear and exertion. "You're too slow," the boatswain tells you, his face impassive. "Next time you're that slow aloft, you'll feel my cane. The ship can't wait for you to gather your courage. When the order comes, you move. Understood?" "Aye, aye, sir." You manage. You're learning. Slowly and painfully, but you're learning. The names of the lines are starting to stick in your memory. Your hands are developing calluses. You're getting better at anticipating which orders will come next, at moving into position before you're specifically told. The complexity of the rigging is beginning to make sense, revealing itself as a logical system rather than random chaos. But you're also learning that there's no room for error, no patience for weakness, no sympathy for fear. The ship operates on precision and timing, and every sailor must be a perfectly functioning part of that mechanism. Your life depends on learning quickly, on never making the same mistake twice, on pushing through exhaustion and fear to do what's required. And this is still just the beginning. You're learning the basics in relatively calm conditions while the ship rides at anchor or sails coastal waters. Eventually, you'll be doing all of this in storms, in battles, in emergencies where men's lives depend on your competence. The thought terrifies you, but like everything else aboard this ship, your terror is irrelevant. You'll learn because you must. The alternative is death, either quick from a fall or slow from punishment and disease. Welcome to life as a sailor. You're starting to understand why the press gangs have to drag men aboard by force. The bosun's pipe cuts through your dreams at 4 a.m, shrill and insistent. You've been asleep for perhaps 3 hours, wedged into your hammock on the crowded berth deck, where 200 men sleep in a space that reeks of unwashed bodies, bilge water, and the general rot that accumulates in the bowels of a wooden ship. The pipe is followed immediately by the bosun's mates moving through the deck, shouting, "All hands! All hands! Show a leg there! Lash up and stow!" This is your life now, governed by the watch system that never stops, never varies, never grants you a full night's sleep. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off, around the clock, every day, forever. Except it's not quite that simple, because even during your off-watch hours, you're rarely allowed to simply rest. There's always work to be done, always some task that requires all hands, always the captain's whim or the first lieutenant's inspection, or the bosun's eternal demand for maintenance. You roll out of your hammock, your body aching from yesterday's work aloft and the day before's and the day before that. Your hands are a mass of cuts, blisters, and rope burns that never quite heal because you're using them constantly. Your shoulders and back hurt from hauling on lines. Your legs are bruised from being thrown against bulkheads and railings as the ship rolls. You're 28 years old and you feel 50. The first task, as always, is lashing up your hammock. You've gotten better at this over the past weeks, rolling it tight and securing it with the prescribed 7 turns of the lashing. The hammock must be stowed in the nettings by the time you reach the deck, and if it's not done properly, if a single loose end hangs down or the roll isn't tight enough, you'll answer for it. The hammock inspection is one of the petty tyrannies that govern your existence, a way for the officers and bosun's mates to exert control and find fault. On deck, the morning watch is already at work, but the rest of the crew is mustered for the daily ritual that begins every day in the Royal Navy. Holystoning the deck. Holystones are blocks of sandstone, large ones the size of Bibles that require 2 men to push, smaller ones the size of prayer books that you work on your knees. The deck must be scrubbed white every day, regardless of weather, regardless of how clean it already is. You're handed a small holystone and a bucket of seawater. Down on your knees you go, scrubbing at planks that are already pale from yesterday's scrubbing. Your knees quickly become raw from the rough wood. Your hands, gripping the stone, develop new blisters on top of old ones. The salt water stings every cut and abrasion. Around you, dozens of other sailors are doing the same, working in lines, moving slowly aft across the deck, while bosun's mates patrol behind you, their canes ready for anyone who appears to be shirking. "Put your backs into it," one of them shouts. "The captain wants to see his face in these planks." This goes on for an hour, sometimes longer. By the time you're finished, your knees are bleeding, your back is screaming, and you're soaked with sea water and sweat. But the deck is white, and that's what matters. Cleanliness aboard a warship is partly about hygiene, but mostly about discipline and order. The spotless deck is a visible symbol of control, proof that the crew is being kept busy and obedient. After holystoning comes washing down the deck with seawater, pumped up from over the side. Then comes sweeping it dry. Then comes coiling every single line on the ship into perfect spirals, laid out just so. The deck must be perfect before the officers appear for their morning inspection. Around 6 in the morning, you finally break your fast. Breakfast isn't a meal exactly, more a desperate consumption of whatever food is available. Your mess of 8 men receives its ration. Burgoo, a thin porridge made from oatmeal boiled in water with perhaps a hint of butter if you're lucky. It's served lukewarm in a wooden kid, a small tub that your mess shares. You eat with your hands or a spoon if you have one, standing or sitting on the deck, gulping it down quickly because you know you'll be called back to work at any moment. There's also your daily ration of beer, a gallon per man. The beer is weak, more like thin ale, but it's safer than the water in the casks, which turns green and slimy within weeks at sea. You drink your beer throughout the day, and you're grateful for it. When the beer runs out, as it eventually does on long voyages, you'll be reduced to that foul water, and then you'll know what real thirst is. The morning continues with work. Always work. If you're part of the watch on deck, you're constantly trimming sails, hauling on braces, adjusting sheets as the wind shifts, and the officers demand minute changes to the ship's heading. If you're technically off watch, you're assigned to other tasks. Splicing rope, serving and parceling the standing rigging to protect it from weather, tarring, painting, scraping, the endless maintenance that keeps a wooden ship from falling apart. Around noon comes dinner, the main meal of the day, and you line up with your mess at the galley for your ration. Today it's salt pork, chunks of meat so thoroughly salted for preservation that it's almost inedible. Each man gets about a pound, along with dried peas that have been boiled into a grey sludge. The pork has been in the cask for months, possibly years. It's so hard you can carve it like wood. The Navy boils it to soften it slightly, but it still tastes more of salt than meat. Your mess takes its ration back to your section of the berth deck. One of your messmates, an old hand named William, has fashioned a knife from a piece of scrap metal, and he divides the pork as evenly as possible. There's always tension during this division. Is one piece slightly larger than another? Did William give himself the best bit? But everyone knows that accusations of unfairness can lead to fights, and fights lead to flogging. So the meat is divided and consumed in tense silence. You try to soak your portion in water to leach out some of the salt, but there's never enough time or enough fresh water. You chew the tough, salty meat, washing it down with your beer ration, and tell yourself it's food, it's protein, it's keeping you alive. The peas are at least easier to eat, though they have no flavor, and the texture is unpleasant. Some men have saved bits of biscuit from breakfast and dunk them in the pea water to soften them. Others, the clever ones who've been at sea for years, have somehow acquired small amounts of pepper or mustard and use it to make the food slightly less monotonous. After dinner, there's no rest. The afternoon is filled with more work, and often this is when the truly exhausting tasks are scheduled. Gun drill, for instance, where your mess is assigned to one of the 50 cannons on this ship, and you spend hours learning to load, run out, fire, and swab the gun in an endless repetition until the motions are automatic. The gun weighs well over a ton, and moving it requires the coordinated effort of its entire crew, hauling on tackles to run it forward, wrestling it back into position after the recoil. The gunner, a warrant officer with powder burns scarring his hands and face, walks among the gun crews, timing you with his watch. "Faster! The French won't wait for you to figure out which end of the rammer goes in the barrel. Again!" And you do it again and again, until your shoulders are on fire and your hands are bleeding from the rough rope of the gun tackles. Or perhaps this afternoon is sail drill, where the entire crew is called to make sail, take it in, make it again, reef it, shake out the reefs, all at the officer's whim. This is training, supposedly, preparation for when you'll need to do all of this in combat or in a storm, but it's also simply a way to keep the crew exhausted and obedient, too tired to think about mutiny or complaint. The watch system continues throughout all of this. Every 4 hours, the watches change. The afternoon watch becomes the first dog watch at 4 in the afternoon. At 6, the second dog watch begins. The dog watches are shorter, 2 hours each instead of 4, which means the watch schedule shifts each day. If you had the middle watch last night, midnight to 4 in the morning, you'll have a different watch tonight. This rotation means you never establish a regular sleep pattern, never adjust to a consistent schedule. You're always tired, always slightly disoriented, never quite sure what time it is or how long you've been awake. During your watch on deck, you're expected to be alert and ready, even if you've been awake for 20 hours and worked yourself to exhaustion. You stand at your station, or you're sent aloft to take in a sail, or you're ordered to man the pumps. Because the ship always leaks, always requires pumping to keep the water in the bilges from rising too high. The officers and midshipmen patrol the deck, watching for any sign of inattention or sluggishness. Fall asleep on watch and you'll be flogged. Fail to respond immediately to an order, and you'll be caned. There's no mercy for exhaustion. Around 8 in the evening comes supper, though calling it a meal is generous. You receive your remaining daily ration, more biscuit, perhaps some cheese if the stores include it, your final portion of beer. The cheese is often so hard and so filled with weevils that you eat it in dim light so you can't see the movement. The biscuit, ship's biscuit, hardtack, call it what you will, is barely edible even when fresh. After a few months at sea, it's infested with weevils too. You learn to tap it against the table before eating, knocking the weevils out. Mostly. The ones that remain are extra protein, you tell yourself, trying not to think about it. There's a brief period after supper when you might have something approaching free time, if you're not on watch. Some men use it to mend their clothes, sewing patches on patches with needle and thread bought from the purser at inflated prices. Others carve small objects from wood scraps, the intricate scrimshaw that sailors make to pass the endless hours at sea. A few men have managed to acquire books or newspapers from the last port, and these are shared and read until they fall apart from handling. Some men just sit and stare at nothing, too exhausted even to sleep, trapped in a kind of waking stupor. Around 10 in the evening, if you're lucky enough to be off watch, you can finally sling your hammock and attempt to sleep. You wedge yourself into the narrow space, trying to find a position that doesn't aggravate your various injuries, listening to the sounds of 200 men doing the same around you. The snoring, the coughing, the groaning of men in pain, the creaking of the ship, the constant sound of water against the hull. The air is thick and foul, ventilation poor at best. In summer, the berth deck is suffocatingly hot. In winter, it's bitterly cold, and your single thin blanket provides little warmth. You lie there, trying to sleep, knowing that in a few hours the boatswain's pipe will shrill again and the cycle will repeat. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Except when all hands are called, which happens several times a day. Except during emergencies, when you might be kept on deck for 8, 12, 16 hours straight. Except during the captain's whim, when he decides the crew needs additional drill or punishment or simply because he can. There is no weekend, no day of rest, no vacation. Sunday brings a brief church service, the crew mustered on deck while the captain or a chaplain reads from the Book of Common Prayer. But even this is often abbreviated or cancelled if the weather's bad, or the ship is in action. The service is followed immediately by the captain's inspection, walking the deck with the first lieutenant, examining everything, finding fault with the way a line is coiled or a hammock is stowed. The inspection is another opportunity for punishment, another way to maintain the constant pressure of discipline. This is your daily routine at sea. This is every day, every week, every month. The monotony is broken only by storms, by battles, by the rare excitement of spotting another ship or making landfall. But mostly it's just this: work, eat, work, sleep briefly, wake, work again. Your body adapts somewhat. You become stronger in some ways, harder, but you're also being ground down, worn away by the relentless routine and the inadequate food and the constant exhaustion. Men count the days until the ship returns to port. They carve notches in hidden spots below decks, tracking time like prisoners, which, in a sense, you are. You're trapped on this floating wooden prison, subject to absolute authority, worked to the edge of collapse, maintained at just above the minimum level of nutrition and rest required to keep you functioning. And the worst part? This is normal. This is what the Royal Navy considers acceptable, even good conditions. You have a captain who's merely strict rather than sadistic. Your officers are harsh but not actively cruel. Your food, while terrible, arrives on schedule and in the prescribed quantities. The ship is relatively new and sound. Compared to some ships, some crews, you've actually been fortunate. That thought, more than anything else, makes you wonder if you'll survive this voyage with your sanity intact. If this is fortunate, what does unfortunate look like? You're not sure you want to find out, but you have a sinking feeling you're going to discover the answer soon enough. You've been at sea for 6 weeks now, and you're beginning to understand that hunger is not a simple thing. There's the acute hunger of missing a meal, the hollow gnawing in your stomach that you knew occasionally in your old life. Then there's this new kind of hunger, a chronic emptiness that never quite goes away, a sense that your body is slowly consuming itself because the food you're receiving, while technically sufficient to keep you alive, is barely adequate for the brutal physical labor demanded of you. The official ration, as outlined by the victualling board in their infinite wisdom, sounds almost generous when you hear it listed. A pound of biscuit per day, a gallon of beer, 2 pounds of salt beef twice a week, or a pound of salt pork on other days, peas, oatmeal, butter, cheese. On paper, it's enough calories to sustain a working man. In practice, it's a slow starvation dressed up as adequate nutrition. The ship's biscuit is the foundation of your diet, the one constant that appears at every meal. Hardtack, sea biscuit, whatever you call it, it's essentially unleavened bread, baked until all moisture is driven out, creating something more like a cracker than bread, if crackers were made by someone who hated humanity. Each biscuit is about 4 inches square and half an inch thick, hard enough to break teeth, which it regularly does. The older sailors have learned to soften it by soaking it in their beer or in tea if they can get it, letting it absorb liquid until it's merely difficult to chew rather than dangerous. But the real problem with the biscuit isn't its hardness, it's what lives inside it. Weevils, tiny beetles that infest the flour before the biscuit is even baked, thrive in the dark, dry environment of the bread stores. By the time biscuit has been in storage for a few months, every piece is riddled with them. You learn to tap your biscuit against the table before eating, watching the little brown insects tumble out, stunned by the impact. Some fall out. Many don't. You eat them anyway because refusing to eat means starvation, and everyone insists the weevil's a harmless protein. Your messmate Thomas has a saying, "If there's weevils in the biscuit, at least you know it's fresh enough they haven't eaten all of it yet." He claims to have served on a ship where the biscuit was so old and so thoroughly infested that it was more weevil than bread, that you could watch the biscuits move in the sack. You hope he's exaggerating. You're not sure he is. The salt meat is, if anything, worse than the biscuit. The pork and beef issued by the purser comes from barrels where it's been preserved in brine for months or years. The preservation process involves packing the meat in salt so thoroughly that no bacteria can survive, which is excellent for preventing spoilage and terrible for creating something recognizably food-like. The meat emerges from the barrel gray or brown, encrusted with salt crystals, hard as wood, and bearing only the most theoretical resemblance to the animal it came from. On salt pork days, which is most days, the cook boils your ration in sea water. This softens it somewhat, though even after hours of boiling, it remains tough and chewy. The salt content is so high that eating it makes you desperately thirsty, and you gulp your beer ration trying to quench a thirst that never quite goes away. Some of the salt leaches out during boiling, but nowhere near enough. Your lips crack from the salt. Your mouth develops sores. You crave fresh water with an intensity that borders on obsession. The salt beef is worse. Where the pork is at least recognizably pork-shaped, the beef comes in chunks that seem to have been hacked from the carcass at random. Gristle, bone, fat, and occasional pieces of actual muscle tissue all mixed together. The purser is supposed to issue 4-pound pieces, 2 pounds for you and 2 for your messmate, but he has a habit of including bones and unusable scraps in the weight. You've learned to complain loudly about short rations because silence is interpreted as acceptance, but complaining too much gets you marked as a troublemaker. Your mess has developed a tradition around the salt meat. When William divides the portions, cutting each man's ration from the larger piece issued to the mess, he does so with elaborate fairness, making sure everyone can see that the division is as equal as possible. But the pieces vary in quality. One might have more actual meat, another more fat or gristle. So the mess draws lots, using scraps of rope marked with knots to determine who gets which piece. It's a small gesture toward fairness in a profoundly unfair world. On Sundays and Thursdays, instead of salt pork, you receive salt beef and what's optimistically called plum duff. The duff is a boiled pudding made from flour, suet, and a handful of raisins that the cook swears are in there somewhere, though finding one is like discovering treasure. The dough is wrapped in cloth and boiled, emerging as a heavy, dense mass that sits in your stomach like a cannonball. But it's different from the usual rations, and difference, any difference, is valuable when you're eating the same terrible food day after day. The peas that accompany the meat are dried peas, boiled for hours until they disintegrate into a gray sludge. The cook adds nothing to them, no salt, no herbs, no butter, unless you're lucky enough that the butter ration hasn't gone rancid yet. They taste of nothing, or more accurately, they taste of the wooden cask they've been stored in, with notes of bilge water and general decay. You eat them because they're filling, and because refusing food is madness, but you derive no pleasure from the experience. Cheese appears in your rations twice a week, a small piece of hard cheese that's supposed to provide variety. In the first weeks out of port, the cheese is merely unpleasant. Hard, strong-tasting, the kind of cheap cheese that even poor people ashore would turn up their noses at. But as time passes and the ship's stores age, the cheese becomes something else entirely. It dries out until it's rock hard, requiring a knife and considerable effort to cut. It becomes infested, not with weevils, but with tiny mites that give the surface a grayish, moving fuzz. You learn to scrape this off before eating. Mostly. The butter ration is a joke. 4 ounces per man per week sounds reasonable until you see what passes for butter aboard ship. It's rancid before the ship even leaves port, having sat in barrels in the purser's stores for months. By the time it reaches you, it's a yellowish-brown oil with a smell that makes your eyes water. Some men still use it, spreading it on their biscuit or mixing it into their oatmeal, figuring that fat is fat and calories are calories. Others can't stomach it and trade it away for someone else's biscuit or beer. The oatmeal appears 3 times a week as breakfast burgoo, boiled in water to create a thin porridge. When it's freshly made and still hot, it's almost tolerable. By the time it reaches you on the berth deck, It's lukewarm at best, and often cold, congealed into a paste that you eat more from desperation than any actual desire for food. Sometimes the cook adds molasses to sweeten it slightly, creating what's called Scotch coffee. This is an improvement only in the sense that it makes the porridge taste like something other than pure despair. Your beer ration is perhaps the most important part of your daily food supply. A gallon of beer per day sounds like a shocking amount until you realize that this is your primary source of liquid. The water in the ship's casks turns foul within weeks, becoming green and slimy, full of algae and God knows what else. You can strain it through cloth, you can add vinegar to mask the taste, but you can't make it safe or pleasant. So the beer is your drinking water, your refreshment after hours of work, your small comfort in a comfortless world. The beer is weak, perhaps 3% alcohol, less an intoxicant than a way to preserve water by adding hops and alcohol to kill bacteria. It's served at room temperature, which in the tropics means it's body temperature warm, yeasty, and flat. But it's wet, it's relatively safe, and it's yours. When the beer runs out, as it eventually does on long voyages, you're reduced to that foul water, and then you truly understand thirst. As the weeks at sea turn into months, the food situation deteriorates. The biscuit becomes more weevil than bread. The salt meat becomes even harder and more inedible. The butter goes from rancid to actively poisonous. Worst of all, the lack of fresh food begins to take its toll on your body. Your gums become tender and start to bleed. Your old wounds and injuries don't heal properly. You develop strange bruises that appear without cause. You're constantly tired beyond the normal exhaustion of overwork. This is the beginning of scurvy, though you don't know it yet. The complete absence of fresh fruits and vegetables, of anything containing what we would call vitamin C, means your body is slowly falling apart at the cellular level. The ship's surgeon, if he's competent, might issue lemon juice or vinegar as an anti-scorbutic. But supplies are limited, and the officers get first priority. For the common sailors, scurvy is simply a fact of life on long voyages. One more way the sea kills men slowly. You fantasize constantly about fresh food. An apple becomes the object of dreams, crisp and sweet and juicy. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, with real butter that doesn't reek of decay. Vegetables, carrots, onions, cabbage, anything green and growing. Meat that hasn't been salted into leather. Clean water that doesn't taste like the inside of a barrel. These simple things, which you barely noticed in your old life, become precious beyond gold. The officers, of course, eat better. Not well, by shore standards, but infinitely better than you. They have private stores, brought aboard at their own expense. The captain's cabin has fresh eggs packed in salt, preserved lemons, wine, and various luxuries. The wardroom where the lieutenants and warrant officers mess has better cuts of salt meat, actually palatable cheese, tea, sugar, and various condiments. They can afford to buy fresh provisions at every port. You get nothing unless the captain, in a rare moment of generosity, orders livestock slaughtered for the crew's benefit. Sometimes a sailor manages to catch a fish, dangling a line over the stern during his watch. A fresh fish, grilled over a carefully hidden fire, is like a visit from heaven. But this happens rarely, and when it does, the small fish must be shared among the mess, each man getting perhaps a bite or two. Some sailors are expert at catching seabirds that land on the rigging, wringing their necks and plucking them secretly to roast. But this is risky. If caught, you'll be punished for interfering with the ship's routine. On rare occasions, the ship calls at a port, and if you're given shore leave, which is itself rare because the officers know men will desert, you can spend your meager wages on fresh food. You'd be amazed at how quickly a sailor can go through 3 months of pay on fruit, fresh bread, vegetables, anything that doesn't come from a barrel. The local merchants know this and price accordingly, charging desperate sailors whatever the market will bear. But most of the time, you're at sea, and at sea, you eat what you're given. You eat the weevilly biscuit and the salt meat that's more salt than meat. You drink the warm beer and eventually the foul water. You watch your body slowly deteriorate from the inadequate diet, your strength ebbing even as the work demands more and more from you. You learn that hunger is not a temporary condition, but a permanent state, that you will never quite have enough to eat, that food is something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Your messmate Thomas, who's been in the Navy for 15 years, puts it best one evening as you're choking down your salt pork. The worst part ain't that the food's terrible. You get used to terrible. The worst part is knowing that this is breakfast, dinner, and supper, today and tomorrow and next month and next year. Same weevils, same salt, same hunger. The food don't kill you quick, but it kills you sure enough. Slow starvation dressed up as 3 meals a day. He's right, you realize. The food is killing you, just slowly enough that you'll remain useful for a few more years before your teeth fall out, your bones become brittle, and your body gives up entirely. But by then, the Navy will have gotten its work out of you, and there's always another press gang bringing in fresh men to replace those who've been used up. You eat your ration and try not to think about it. What else can you do? You've been aboard for 3 months when you witness your first flogging. The entire crew is mustered on deck at 8 bells in the forenoon watch, assembled in their divisions, facing aft toward the quarterdeck, where the captain and officers stand in their uniforms. The Marines are lined up with their muskets, not exactly pointing at the crew, but not exactly pointing away either. The message is clear. You will watch, you will be silent, and you will learn. The prisoner is brought up from below where he's been confined in irons. His name is John Harris, and his crime is theft. He was caught stealing another man's rum ration. It's not his first offense. He was caned for drunkenness 2 weeks ago, and before that, he received a 12 lashes for insolence to a midshipman. Now he's earned himself a proper flogging, and the entire ship's company will witness what happens to men who refuse to learn. Harris is stripped to the waist and seized up to a grating that's been rigged upright against the main mast. His wrists are tied to the top corners, his arms stretched above his head. His back is already scarred from previous floggings, pale lines crisscrossing the skin. The ship's master-at-arms reads out the charge and the sentence, 3 dozen lashes. 3 dozen. 36 strokes with the cat-o'-9 tails. You've heard the veterans talk about flogging, but hearing about it and seeing it are different things entirely. The boatswain's mate who will administer the punishment steps forward, the cat in his hand. The cat-o'-nine-tails is exactly what it sounds like. A rope handle perhaps 2 feet long, from which hang 9 separate tails of knotted cord, each about 2 feet in length. The knots are hard and tight, designed to tear flesh rather than simply bruise it. The boatswain's mate is a powerful man. He has to be, because 36 strokes is exhausting work for the man swinging the cat. "Do your duty," the captain says, his voice carrying across the silent deck. The boatswain's mate draws back and swings. The cat whistles through the air and lands across Harris's back with a sound like a wet cloth hitting wood, a meaty thwack that makes you flinch. Harris grunts, but doesn't cry out. 9 parallel lines appear across his back, red welts rising immediately. "1," counts the master-at-arms. The second stroke lands slightly lower, overlapping the first. Harris's body jerks against the grating. Still no sound from him beyond harsh breathing. 2. By the 5th stroke, the welts are bleeding. The knotted cords have broken the skin, and thin trickles of blood run down Harris's back. By the 10th stroke, his back is a mass of red and purple, the individual marks beginning to blend together into one continuous wound. Harris is moaning now, unable to stay silent, his fists clenched white where they're tied to the grating. You want to look away. You can't. Everyone is watching, and not watching would be noticed, would mark you as weak or sympathetic to the prisoner. So you watch as the boatswain's mate works his way through the sentence, stroke after stroke, the cat rising and falling with mechanical precision. At 15 strokes, Harris screams. It's a raw, animal sound that makes your stomach clench. His back is no longer recognizably human skin. It's a torn landscape of broken flesh, blood running freely down to soak into his trousers. The boatswain's mate pauses, breathing hard from the exertion, and the first lieutenant nods for him to continue. By 24 strokes, Harris is sobbing, begging, promising anything if they'll just stop. The captain's face remains impassive. The sentence is 3 dozen, and 3 dozen it will be. The cat falls again and again. By 30 strokes, Harris is barely conscious, held upright only by the ropes binding his wrists. His back looks like raw meat. 36, the master-at-arms finally counts. They cut Harris down, and he collapses onto the deck. 2 sailors drag him below to the surgeon, leaving a trail of blood on the freshly holy-stoned planks. The captain addresses the crew. "Let this serve as a lesson to you all. Theft aboard this ship will not be tolerated. Discipline must be maintained." Dismissed, you file below with the others in silence. Later, you learn that Harris survives, though he'll carry those scars for life. He'll be back at work within a week, because the ship needs every able body and sentiment is a luxury the Navy can't afford. You also learn that 3 dozen lashes is considered a moderate sentence. Men have received far worse. The cat-o'-nine-tails is the Navy's primary tool for maintaining discipline, and it's used liberally. A dozen lashes is a common sentence for what are considered minor offenses: drunkenness, being slow to obey orders, disrespect to superiors, fighting among the crew. 2 or 3 dozen lashes for more serious crimes. For major offenses, striking an officer, desertion, mutiny, the sentence can be hundreds of lashes, which is effectively a death sentence even if the man somehow survives the flogging itself. The captain has near absolute discretion in awarding punishment. There's no trial, no appeal, no due process. If the captain believes you've committed an offense, you're guilty. Some captains are relatively restrained in their use of the cat, reserving it for serious crimes. Others flog men for the smallest infractions, believing that liberal use of the cat is necessary to maintain discipline. You've landed somewhere in the middle with Captain Harrington. He'll flog you if he believes you deserve it, but he's not capricious about it. Below the level of formal flogging lies a whole ecosystem of lesser punishments. The boatswain's mates and petty officers carry rattan canes, and they use them freely to encourage faster work or punish minor infractions on the spot. A man who's slow climbing the rigging gets a blow across the shoulders. Someone who doesn't jump quickly enough when an order is given receives a strike to the back or legs. The cane hurts intensely, raises welts, and serves as a constant reminder that violence is always just a moment away. Starting, or striking a man with a rope end, is another common form of immediate punishment. Officers and boatswain's mates carry rope ends specifically for this purpose, using them to strike sailors who displease them. It's technically supposed to be limited to certain situations, but in practice, any man in authority can strike any man below him with near impunity. Then there's stoppage of grog, a punishment that might sound mild until you understand what it means. Your daily ration of rum or beer is one of the few pleasures in your miserable existence, a moment of warmth and slight relief from the constant hardship. Having it stopped for days or weeks is psychological torture on top of the physical deprivation. Men deprived of their grog ration become desperate, sometimes to the point of violence, which of course earns them further punishment. Extra duties are another common punishment. You're already worked to exhaustion in the normal course of events, so being assigned additional tasks during your precious hours of rest is genuinely terrible. You might be sent to pump the bilges for hours during your watch below, or ordered to scrub the heads, the ship's toilets, which are boards with holes hung over the bow, filthy beyond description, or given some other degrading and exhausting task. Confinement in irons is reserved for more serious offences or for men awaiting flogging. The ship's hold contains a small space where prisoners are kept, their ankles shackled together, sometimes their wrists as well. You're left in darkness, in a space so low you can't stand upright, surrounded by the stench of bilge water and rats. You're given reduced rations and water. Hours stretch into days. Men emerge from confinement pale, weakened, and thoroughly cowed. For the most serious offences short of execution, there's running the gauntlet. The entire crew is assembled in 2 lines facing each other, each man armed with a rope end. The prisoner must walk slowly between these lines while every man strikes him as he passes. It's supposed to be punishment by your peers, but in practice it's organized brutality. Some men strike lightly, reluctant to hurt a messmate. Others take the opportunity to work out their own frustrations, striking as hard as they can. The prisoner emerges bruised and bleeding from dozens of blows. Keel hauling, the punishment you've heard the most terrifying stories about, is rare by the 18th century, officially discontinued in many navies, but still whispered about in tones of horror. The victim is tied to a rope that runs under the ship's keel from one side to the other, then dragged underwater beneath the ship. If the barnacles on the hull don't shred you to ribbons, you'll likely drown before they pull you up on the other side. Even if you survive, you'll carry the scars forever. You've never seen it done, but the threat hangs over everything like a ghost. The ultimate punishment is hanging, reserved for the most serious crimes: murder, mutiny, persistent desertion. You've not witnessed a hanging yet, but you know it happens. The entire crew is mustered to watch as the condemned man is brought on deck, a noose placed around his neck, and the rope run up to the yardarm. At the captain's signal, the man is hauled up by his neck, kicking and struggling as he strangles to death. His body is left hanging for hours as a warning, then cut down and buried at sea without ceremony. What makes all this punishment particularly terrible is its arbitrariness. Yes, there are official regulations about what constitutes an offense and what punishment is appropriate. But in practice, everything depends on the mood of the officer who catches you, the captain's temperament, whether the ship has recently suffered from discipline problems, even something as simple as whether the captain slept poorly last night. Two men might commit the same offense on the same day. One gets caned, the other gets 24 lashes, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. An action that's overlooked when the ship is in good spirits becomes a flogging offense when tensions are high. The officer's whims are law, and you have no recourse, no appeal, no voice in your own defense. The constant threat of punishment infects every moment of your existence. You're always aware that your one mistake, one moment of slowness, one perceived sign of disrespect away from pain. It makes you careful to the point of paralysis. You hesitate before speaking to an officer, weighing every word for possible offense. You jump at every order, even if you don't understand it, because questioning orders is insubordination. You work through exhaustion and injury because showing weakness invites punishment. The veterans have developed strategies for surviving in this environment. They teach you to make yourself invisible when possible, to avoid drawing the attention of officers or midshipmen. They show you how to read the moods of those in authority, to know when the first lieutenant is in a foul temper and extra vigilance is required. They explain the unwritten rules. Certain officers are more dangerous than others. Certain times of day are riskier. Certain behaviors are more likely to provoke punishment. You learn to watch the captain's face during morning inspection, gauging his mood by subtle signs. You learn which midshipmen are reasonable and which are tyrannical. You learn that the boatswain's mate Jenkins is strict but fair, while another boatswain's mate named Crowley is actively cruel and enjoys inflicting pain. This knowledge becomes survival information, as important as knowing how to tie a bowline or set a sail. The punishment system also creates an atmosphere of fear and mistrust among the crew. Men inform on each other to curry favor with the officers or to settle personal grudges. Someone steals your ration of tobacco, and you can't report it without risking being accused of theft yourself. After all, how did you come to have extra tobacco in the first place? Disputes between sailors rarely go to the officers, because both parties know they're likely to both be punished just for causing trouble. You've learned to settle your own disputes quietly, or to let things go, or to accept losses rather than invite official attention. When your messmate William takes slightly more than his share of the salt pork, you say nothing, because complaining could lead to both of you being punished for disturbing the peace. When another sailor accidentally knocks your biscuit into the filthy deck, you pick it up and eat it anyway, because starting a fight would mean a flogging for both of you. The Marines exist primarily to enforce this system of punishment and control. They're not sailors. They don't work the ship. They don't go aloft. They don't haul on ropes. They stand guard with muskets. They patrol with fixed bayonets. They serve as the captain's enforcers. During a flogging, they stand in formation with loaded weapons, ready to suppress any resistance from the crew. During potential mutiny situations, they would fire on the sailors without hesitation. Everyone knows this. The Marines sleep separately, eat separately, and socialize separately because fraternizing with sailors would compromise their ability to shoot them if ordered. One evening, sitting with your mess after a particularly brutal day that saw 2 men flogged for drunkenness, your messmate Thomas shares his philosophy on surviving the punishment system. The trick, he says quietly, is to be good enough that they don't notice you, not so good that you stand out. Officers hate men who make them look bad. Not so poor that you're marked as useless. Just middling, just competent enough, just invisible enough. Do your work, keep your mouth shut, don't volunteer for anything, don't complain about anything. Be a ghost who happens to pull on ropes when told. It's depressing advice, but it's also clearly effective. Thomas has survived 15 years in the Navy, which is more than can be said for most pressed men. You resolve to follow his example, to make yourself as unnoticeable as possible, to give no excuse for punishment. But you also know that sometimes punishment comes regardless of what you do, that the system is designed to crush you, to break your spirit, to remind you constantly that you have no rights, no dignity, no control over your own fate. You're property of the Royal Navy, and property can be damaged or destroyed at the owner's discretion. You've seen grown men weep after a flogging, not from the pain alone, but from the humiliation and helplessness of it. You've seen men's spirits break, watched them become hollow-eyed automatons who do exactly as they're told with no spark of humanity remaining. You've seen men driven to desperation, to desertion attempts that almost always fail and result in even worse punishment. And somewhere deep inside, in a place you're careful never to let show on your face or in your actions, you feel rage. Rage at the injustice of it, at the cruelty, at the system that treats human beings as expendable tools. But that rage must stay buried, must never surface, because expressing it would mean the cat, or worse. So you swallow your anger, you keep your head down, you do as you're told, and you hope that you can survive this voyage without feeling the cat's bite across your own back. That's the best you can hope for, to be invisible enough, obedient enough, lucky enough to avoid punishment. In the Royal Navy of the 18th century, that counts as a good life. Death was never far from an 18th century sailor. Long before the roar of cannons or the crash of splintering masts threatened a man's life, disease and injury stalked him quietly, patiently, in the darkness of the ship's hold, in the stale air of the lower decks, in the damp corners where rats darted and fleas bred. For all its romance, billowing sails, distant horizons, and the promise of gold. Life at sea during this age of exploration and empire was dominated by sickness. A sailor's greatest enemy was not the opposing navy or the unpredictable ocean, but his own fragile body, left vulnerable in a harsh environment where medicine was primitive, nutrition was poor, and the sea punished every mistake. This was the world of the ship's surgeon, a figure equal parts necessary and terrifying. Sailors feared him almost as much as they needed him. He was the man who stood between life and death, scalpels in hand, surrounded by groans, the reek of blood, and barrels of preserved limbs. But he was also the man who saved lives in an era when the simplest illness could kill. The slow death of scurvy. No disease was more infamous or more feared than scurvy. It didn't strike suddenly like fever or dysentery. It crept in slowly, silently, day by day, worsening in ways that sailors could feel but never fully predict. The first signs were small: fatigue, aching joints, a sense that one's legs were heavier than they should be. A sailor might think he just needed sleep. But soon his gums would swell, soft and purple. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old scars reopened. Bruises appeared without cause. Wounds that should have healed instead festered and spread. Skin split at the slightest touch. Internal bleeding began, and always came the exhaustion, so deep a man could barely stand. Scurvy was caused by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, but in the 18th century, this simple explanation was not yet widely accepted. Many officers still believed it came from laziness, poor discipline, or weak character. So sailors watched helplessly as their bodies decayed, knowing there was little they, or the surgeon, could do. On a long voyage, scurvy could claim more men than battle. Ships sailing months from port often lost a third of their crew before ever sighting land. When the symptoms grew severe, a man was placed on the surgeon's list, given small rations of whatever acidic foods the ship carried, sometimes vinegar, sometimes the juice of pickled cabbage, and told to rest. But rest was rare aboard a working ship, and so many simply died in their hammocks, too weak to climb the ladder to the deck and feel the sun on their faces one last time. The filthy surgeon's mate. Every ship of size carried a surgeon, educated, trained, and, usually, competent. But the real day-to-day medical labor often fell to the surgeon's mate, a man with limited training, questionable hygiene, and very little patience. Many mates were former barbers, butchers, failed apprentices, or simply sailors who showed a willingness to assist with grisly work. They were expected to mix medicines, sterilize tools, though sterilization as we know it did not exist, and hold down patients during operations. Their tools were crude: bone saws, knives, forceps, cautery irons, needles, and thread. The instruments were rarely cleaned beyond a quick wipe on a dirty rag or a dip in seawater. Everything smelled of blood, rum, sweat, and decay. The sick berth, the surgeon's domain, was often located deep in the bowels of the ship, dark, cramped, and sweltering in the tropics. Ventilation was poor, and the air was heavy with the stench of vomit, rot, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Patients lay on rough hammocks, unable to escape the rats that ran along the beams above them. In this space, disease spread like fire. Despite these horrifying conditions, the surgeon and his mate did what they could. Infections were treated with poultices of herbs or vinegar. Burns were soothed with animal fat. Tooth pain meant extraction with iron pliers. Fevers were met with bleeding or purging, treatments that often weakened a man further rather than healing him. Amputations without anesthesia. If there was a single moment that defined the brutality of maritime medicine, it was the amputation table. Few procedures were more common, or more dreaded. A splinter of wood shot from a cannon strike could shred a man's leg as efficiently as any musket ball. Accidents with rigging left limbs crushed or mangled beyond repair. Infection from minor injuries could spread so quickly in the filthy environment that a surgeon sometimes had hours to decide whether cutting off a limb could save a life. There was no anesthesia. A man was given rum, as much as he could swallow, and a leather strap to bite down on. 2 sailors restrained his arms. Another pinned his good leg. The surgeon worked quickly. A skilled naval surgeon could remove a leg below the knee in under 2 minutes. Any slower, and the man's chance of survival decreased sharply. First came the tourniquet, applied tightly to slow the bleeding. Then the surgeon made a swift, deep incision through the skin and muscle, peeling them back like the layers of an orange. The saw came next. A short, sturdy tool designed to cut through bone with horrifying efficiency. Once the bone was removed, the remaining tissue had to be shaped and tied off. Arteries were clamped or cauterized with a hot iron. The stump was then sewn shut. Screams filled the hold. Some men fainted, some went into shock immediately, some bit through the strap entirely. A few died on the table. Those who survived the procedure still faced the greatest danger of all: infection. Even the cleanest operation often led to gangrene, fever, and a death that stretched on for days. But for many sailors, the amputation table was their only chance. If the surgeon acted quickly and the patient's constitution was strong, he might live to serve again, hobbling across the deck on a wooden peg. Festering wounds and tropical diseases. During voyages in the Caribbean, West Africa, or the Indian Ocean, sailors encountered a new host of horrors. Mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever, contaminated water laden with dysentery, and parasites that burrowed beneath the skin. Tropical climates only made the misery worse. Heat and humidity kept wounds moist, slowing healing and encouraging rot. Small cuts from rope burns or splinters, common and unavoidable, quickly became infected. Without antibiotics, infection meant fever, swelling, and searing pain. Some wounds oozed pus constantly, others blackened at the edges. The surgeon could lance them, flush them with vinegar, or apply herbal poultices, but often the body was overwhelmed. Malaria brought shivering fits, intense heat, delirium, and for many, death. Yellow fever turned a man's eyes a ghastly shade of orange. Vomit turned black as the body failed. Dysentery caused dehydration so severe that a man could die in a matter of days, weakened until he could no longer climb into his hammock. On some voyages, especially in tropical waters, the sick list grew so long that the ship functioned at half its strength. Officers feared not just the diseases themselves, but the collapse of order that might follow. A crew sickened by fever could no longer man the sails, load the cannons, or keep watch for reefs. Disease could destroy a ship more effectively than any enemy, and it often did. The mortality rate at sea. Modern readers may find it shocking, but on many long voyages of the 18th century, more sailors died from disease and accidents than from battle. Mortality rates varied widely depending on the length of the journey, the ship's supplies, and the skill of the surgeon. But estimates suggest that anywhere from 10% to 40% of a crew might perish during a major expedition. On naval warships, conditions were slightly better. Admiralty regulations required surgeons, sick berths, and some medicinal supplies. Merchantmen and privateers often had far worse conditions. In extreme cases, scurvy or fever could claim half the crew before the ship ever reached its destination. Death was so common that sailors learned not to grow too attached. A man gone by morning might be replaced by noon. Grief had no time to linger. Burials at sea. When death finally came, the ritual was simple, swift, and deeply practical. Space was precious aboard a ship. Bodies could not be kept long in the heat. The carpenter built a crude plank. The dead man's hammock became his shroud, sewn shut with a final stitch through the nose, a precaution to ensure he was truly dead. Cannonballs were tied to his feet so he would sink. The crew gathered on deck as the chaplain or captain read a brief passage. There was no music, no stone to mark the passing, only the wind and the creaking of the timbers. Then the plank tipped. The body slid into the sea with a final splash, claimed by the vast, indifferent ocean. Within moments, the ceremony was over, and the ship continued on its course. The dead were forgotten quickly, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. Life aboard ship went on. To be an 18th-century sailor was to live with constant risk, constant illness, and constant fear of the surgeon's table. Every day demanded physical strength and mental endurance. Every voyage held the possibility that a man might never return home. Disease shaped the sailor's world, what he ate, how he worked, how he slept, and how he died. Yet sailors faced all this with remarkable resilience. They joked about their own misfortune, drank together, helped each other through fever or injury, and believed that as long as they kept the sea beneath them and the wind in their sails, they were doing what fate had intended. In this world of hardship and danger, the surgeon was both a grim reaper and a guardian. And aboard an 18th-century ship, where sickness lurked in every shadow, he was, for many, the thin line between survival and the endless depths below. After months at sea, months of salt-crusted clothes, worm-eaten biscuits, swollen gums, and cramped hammocks, the cry of "Land ho!" was enough to send a surge of electricity through the entire crew. It meant salvation. It meant solid ground. It meant food that didn't crawl, air that didn't stink, and the possibility, however small, of a night's rest without the slap of the waves against the hull or the roar of storms overhead. But a port call for an 18th-century sailor was never the paradise he imagined. It was a brief intermission in a long, grinding play, one where the next act always promised more hardship. Though many sailors dreamed of land during their long watches on deck, what awaited them when they reached it could be freedom, terror, or, most often, a chaotic mixture of both. The euphoria of arrival. The moment the anchor dropped and the decks were cleared, sailors were transformed. Men who had been weak from scurvy or hollow-eyed from sleepless nights became almost giddy. The sight of a bustling harbour, flags of foreign nations, dock workers shouting, crates of fruit and spices, taverns lining narrow streets, promised everything the sea had denied them. For weeks, sometimes months, a sailor hadn't been able to drink fresh water without the taste of mold, see a woman eat a meal that wasn't salted beyond recognition, sleep without fear of being shaken awake for the next watch. So when liberty was granted, even for a short while, he ran headlong into it. Heart first, coin purse second. In many ports the sailors had barely set foot on shore before they were approached by merchants, innkeepers, gamblers, clerks, brothel workers, and pickpockets, all eager to relieve them of the month's wages burning holes in their pockets. Wages that had taken half a year to earn might vanish in a day. And for most sailors, that was exactly the point. Spending every shilling in days. Port towns thrived on sailors. Entire economies were built on the brief explosions of money and desperation that followed the arrival of a ship. Taverns offered watered rum at inflated prices. Brothels raised their fees the moment a fleet arrived. Even food vendors doubled their rates, knowing the crew would pay anything for fresh bread, fruit, or meat. Some sailors blew their pay on gambling, dice games, cards, or rigged bets, drinking to the point of unconsciousness. Nights in the arms of prostitutes buying bright, impractical clothing gifts for families they hadn't seen in years. Others tried to save their money, tucking their earnings into belts or boots. But the temptations of the port were overwhelming, and most returned to the ship penniless, hungover, and sometimes infected with something far worse than mere regret. Wives in every port. The saying was more than a joke. It was a survival mechanism. Sailors, uncertain if they would ever return to the same place again, often formed temporary marriages. These relationships varied wildly: affectionate, transactional, exploitative, or mutually beneficial. Some women supported sailors by washing their clothes, cooking meals, or offering companionship. Others were sex workers or tavern girls who understood the rhythms of the sea trade. For a sailor, a wife in port meant a warm bed, clean clothing, someone to listen to his stories, the first hint of comfort after months of brutality. But these arrangements were never permanent. The ship always called them back. Many sailors left behind illegitimate children they would never meet. Others promised to return and never did, carried away by storms, war, or disease. And when the ship came back months or years later, the woman might be married to another man, working in a different tavern, or long since dead. Port love was always temporary, sweet, desperate, and fleeting. The warm waters of the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, or West Africa held stunning beauty, but also some of the deadliest hazards sailors ever faced. Tropical ports offered fruits, music, lively markets, and exotic goods. but beneath the color and noise lurked yellow fever, malaria, cholera, venereal disease, violent crime, predatory tavern owners who drugged sailors to steal their pay. Mosquitoes swarmed the docks at dusk. Filth ran through the streets. Fresh water sources teemed with bacteria invisible to the eye. A sailor might step onto land healthy and step back aboard a week later shivering with fever. Some never made it back at all. Venereal disease. The quiet curse, brothels were among the busiest establishments in every major port. Sailors sought comfort wherever they could find it, and the combination of loneliness, alcohol, and pent-up desire made them easy customers. But the consequence of these encounters was often venereal disease, particularly syphilis and gonorrhea. Syphilis could begin with a small sore, then escalate into rashes, bone pain, neurological damage, blindness, and madness. Gonorrhea brought burning pain, discharge, and swelling that could make a sailor unable to work the rigging or even walk properly. Treatments were horrific: mercury ointments, painful injections, or cauterizing irons heated to glowing orange. Many sailors went untreated, carrying the disease with them from port to port, suffering silently. Press gangs. Freedom trapped in a net. For all their excitement about reaching land, sailors knew that stepping off the ship made them vulnerable to one of their greatest fears: press gangs. These government-sanctioned kidnappers roamed port towns looking for able-bodied men to forcibly recruit into naval service. Their methods were simple. Find a drunken or isolated sailor, knock him unconscious, drag him aboard a naval vessel, invent a story claiming he had volunteered. Some men woke up at sea with a pounding head and a new life, one they had never chosen. Press gangs were particularly aggressive in wartime, when the demand for sailors soared. Merchant ships and private vessels often lost half their men during a single port call, forcing captains to recruit replacements on short notice. Even experienced sailors feared going ashore alone, knowing a dark alley or a late-night stumble might mean losing not only their freedom, but years of their life. Desertion attempts, running toward land, failing toward the sea. For sailors who hated their captain, suffered chronic illness, or simply longed for a different life, port calls represented opportunity, the slim chance to escape forever. Some deserted quietly, melting into the crowds and disappearing inland. Others fled after dark, hiding beneath docks or stowing away on other ships. A few bold men jumped into the water and swam for shore. Desertion was technically a capital offense in many navies. If caught, punishments included. Flogging until the back was raw branding imprisonment in irons reduced rations. Execution in extreme cases. Most deserters weren't successful. Officers posted guards at the gangplank. Marines patrolled the taverns, and local authorities were often paid to capture runaways. Some sailors were dragged back aboard half-conscious, beaten, or still bleeding from the wounds inflicted by those trying to restrain them. Their brief taste of freedom made their return to ship life even more miserable. Daily life in port, between celebration and survival. For the sailor who avoided disease, avoided the press gangs, and didn't attempt desertion, life in port was a chaotic mix of revelry and routine. He might repair his clothing, purchase fresh food, have his hair cut, Write letters home, refill his tobacco pouch, re-shoe, a pair of worn boots, enjoy music, dancing or festivals depending on the port life was loud, bright, and overwhelming. Exotic languages filled the air, Portuguese in Brazil, Spanish in Havana, French in the Caribbean, Malay in the Indian Ocean, Arabic along the East African coast. Markets sold spices, trinkets, and food a sailor had never imagined and might never taste again. But beneath the excitement was the ticking clock. Liberty always ended. The ship never stayed docked forever. The bittersweet departure. The day the signal flag was raised to recall the sailors, heartbreak settled over the crew. Men staggered back to the ship hungover, broke, sometimes bleeding, sometimes limping. Others came willingly, knowing they had nowhere else to go. A few were carried back, still half drunk or feverish. Others were missing entirely, lost to disease, imprisonment, or desertion. Once the anchor was weighed and the sails unfurled, the port grew smaller in the distance. The laughter of taverns faded. The smell of cooking fires and flowers was replaced once again by salt and tar. The horizon swallowed the coastline until only the endless sea remained. And with it came the realization that every joy, every danger, every embrace, every punch-drunk mistake had been temporary. For sailors, the cycle was eternal. Months of hardship, a brief explosion of freedom, new horrors, forced return, and back to sea again. The port call was a taste of life the sea would never permit them to fully grasp. It was a reminder that the world was wide and vivid, just out of reach. And as the ship sailed toward the next stretch of storms and tedium, the memory of land became both comfort and torment, because every sailor knew, if he lived long enough, the cycle would repeat, and the next port might offer salvation or ruin.